of January 9, 2023, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 30 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to, now as we wrap up this week in Congress, I'd like to address some issues that I feel have not been discussed as much as they should be in the chamber this week, and look forward to the issues being highlighted when we return from our break 10 days from now. First of all, I'd like to discuss the very concerning memos coming out of the Richmond office of the FBI. The FBI has kind of embarrassed us over the last year in that there are areas which I would consider more political in nature, but the FBI, perhaps like their counterparts in China or Russia, seem to go after people for what they think more than what they do. And we found out in the last month that they have decided to equate traditional Catholics with groups that ought to be monitored so that they don't do anything too untoward. In their memo, they implied that perhaps traditional Catholics, without evidence that I know, may be opponents to affirmative action, like the majority of Americans. They may not be all on board with the LGBTQ agenda. They may not be thrilled with President Biden's immigration policy. And horror of horrors, they might like to attend a service with Latin Mass. The idea that these conservative Catholics, and I am not Catholic personally, but I have friends who I think would consider themselves conservative Catholics. The idea that they would consider conservative Catholic in line with being an enemy of the state is incredibly scary. I mean, I know traditional Catholics will not do very well in communist China today, and that is perhaps not surprising. It's one of the reasons why we worry about what goes on in China. But it is very scary that this administration would be targeting conservative Catholics for additional monitoring. And it's something that we should be very mindful of. It's something we should insist end. They have said that they are revoking the memo, which is nice. But when you just say that we're getting rid of the memo because it doesn't meet our exacting standards, it implies that you're getting rid of the memo because it's true. And you feel bad that your true feelings about conservative Catholics have now been made public. I have not seen any press release from the FBI, and I hope to see it, in which people are removed from the FBI, say, we don't want you there anymore. If you view your job as not one in which we're going to track down people who are counterfeiting or tracking down people who are selling fentanyl to the state, but instead are going to spend your resources monitoring conservative Catholics, that is of great concern. And make my word, like I said, I personally am not Catholic, but I will tell you, after seeing that memo from the FBI, if I was a member of an Assembly of God church, a Wisconsin Lutheran Synod church, most Baptist churches, evangelical churches, Orthodox Jewish, I would be scared at where our country is going. And I insist that the FBI open up their files and tell us exactly who drafted these repugnant memos and whose idea was it, out of Washington, out of Richmond, who knows, that the FBI should be involved in targeting conservative Catholics. And I hope that the rest of the people of this body, including my leadership team, talks about it every day we get back until we get a better explanation from the FBI exactly what was going on and who in particular were the employees of the FBI who thought it was a good idea to monitor conservative Catholics, of which apparently one piece of evidence is attending Latin Mass. Now, I think we should also have a look at a story that began about 2 years ago, but it's kind of where we can kind of follow it along and see the degree to which President Biden and his administration are following demands made of them about 2 years ago. About 2 years ago, when the Senate was 50-50 with a Democrat vice president, U.S. Senators Tammy Duckworth and Mazie Hirono said that they were tired of confirming any white men appointed by President Biden. That's kind of a scary thing. Actually, they said it would be okay with confirming white men if they were gay. After 2 years were up, a legal journal did a study and found out that 2 years into the Biden administration, only 5 out of 97 judges were white men. We were able to determine that 1 of the 5 was gay. We don't know about the others. I think that's a little bit scary. I think if you're going to take the legal community collectively, remembering that you don't really appoint people to the federal judiciary when they're 26 years old. So when we look at maybe the legal community of people age 95 and up and said we were going to try to find the best judges we can, I would think more than 5 out of 97 judges would be white men who are not gay. But that's what we have, actually probably less than 5, 4 or 3, whatever. But I think it's something for the media to pick up on and ask some more questions here. You know, does the Biden administration really feel that only 5 of 97 judicial openings would be best filled with a white man? I would be asking questions since apparently Senators Duckworth and Senators Hirono felt it was important to give preference to gay men over straight men. I would ask how many of the few white men were appointed were gay and how many were straight. I think that's something that the media was on the board. They would be asking that question. We do know that there are strong elements on the left that don't like traditional families. You know, we know the close ties between the Democrat Party and Black Lives Matter and how early on Black Lives Matter said they don't like Western prescribed traditional families. I always object to the way Black Lives Matter say that because I think we have traditional families with a mom and dad at home through all sorts of different backgrounds. It's not just in Western Europe, but they themselves describe it as Western prescribed traditional families. So I hope that beyond this rather obscure legal journal, we would have a little more investigation by the press and perhaps investigation by some of the relevant committees. Are we continuing down the path of apparently actively discriminating against white heterosexual men? I mean, that's clearly what these 2 senators wanted, and I think it's very concerning that they're getting exactly what they wanted. It's like the Biden administration is just following their tune. So hopefully we will see more articles about this in the paper over the next couple weeks. And hopefully, if I do not get what I want here, hopefully Republican leadership will weigh in and force the Biden administration to comment on this issue and the backgrounds of some of their appointees. Given the obsession or the apparent view of the world, the Biden administration does view people as just representative of where their ancestors lived, 200 years ago. And I don't view it that way. I think most Americans view people as individuals. And if you ask, what do you think about John, or what do you think about Mary, or what do you think about Peter, you talk about their views on things. Maybe you talk about their upbringing or where they grew up, but you don't say the most important thing about that person is whether your ancestors are from Spain or England or India or wherever. Unfortunately, the Biden administration basically seems to throw away the rest of the resume and focus primarily on ethnic background, and that's unfortunate. One way we can see it is in their proposed budget, they seem to put diversity police in all of their different agencies. and it's something that's growing more and more in our universities as well. Some of these diversity police are making $200,000 a year, which is something that scares me in its own right, because if you make $200,000 a year, a lot of people say anything. And if your $200,000 a year job depends on the rather warped idea that we should hire or fire or promote people based on where their great-great-grandparents are from, these people are going to be running around the country telling businesses, telling students that when you meet somebody, the most important thing is their ethnic background. We have seen the result of having these people running around the university and the obsession with this view of the world. So we did have a hearing this week looking at universities, and we'll talk about universities again in a second. But there are a lot of universities who complain that tuition is too high, who purport to care about the high student loan debt out there, who have no problem hiring people for $150,000, $200,000 a year to preach to children that they ought to walk around with a chip on their shoulder because of their background, despite the fact that clearly people are coming from all around the world and succeeding in America. I mean, it's kind of a defeatist thing to tell people that they're going to discriminate against them based on ethnic background. I've talked before about people from all around the world show up at a swearing-in ceremony where people become American, and look at all the people who are hitting the ground running from all around the globe. I mean, I always talk about in my own district, we have a huge Hmong population. I look at how successful they are, how hardworking, how they're living the American dream. And then you hear about these people making $200,000 a year at our universities and our university campuses to tell people they ought to walk around with their chip on their shoulder and saying what a horrible country America is. In any event, I hope all alumni around the country pay attention to what is going on in their alma mater and make sure they are not wasting the students' precious tuition dollars on hiring these people. Now, we have seen the result of these people recently, or this intolerance that they promote, in two separate universities. We're all familiar with what happened at Stanford University. A judge showed up there carrying ideas that, if not a majority, close to a majority of Americans hold. They weren't big on transgenders going into the other person's bathroom and what have you, but they whipped up almost a physical confrontation at Stanford, which, when I get online, is supposed to be the second best law school in the country, at least according to somebody. And these potential lawyers, and if they come from Stanford, they're going to wind up becoming federal judges, very important jobs. They are shouting down people with views on transgenders different than the population as a whole. I don't know how these people are going to get back to home base and become productive lawyers, much less productive judges or productive bureaucrats in the future. We did have a hearing on this the other day, but we think we should have more hearings, specifically what's going on with Stanford. We found similar intolerance of First Amendment free speech at Georgetown, another supposedly good law school. We had a student step forward, William Spruance, talk about what happened to him when he questioned the guidelines with regard to masks. I mean, you get on the internet and there are all sorts of people who say different things about masks, different things about vaccines, but apparently because he stepped outside the orthodoxy at Georgetown Law School, he was threatened. He had to undergo a psychological evaluation. Doesn't that sound like something from the Soviet Union? We disagree with the state, so you have to see a psychiatrist because you must be mentally ill if you don't understand what a great guy Joseph Stalin is. Sounds like that's what we have going on here at Georgetown. Send somebody for a psychiatric evaluation if he doesn't agree with the conventional view on how to deal with COVID. I hope that there is widespread outrage. We like to think people who graduate from college are taught to be open-minded and look at different views on things. But instead, apparently come out of Georgetown, you're taught everybody must fall in line with the state or fall in line with the leadership of the law school. And if you don't, we will weigh in. And despite the fact that you may have spent 2 or 3 years of money and time going to the law school, we're going to do what we can to make sure you don't become a member of the Bar Association. You're not be able to use that degree. Because far more important than your grades or what you know is going on in school is that you know that once you become a lawyer, you wind up being obedient to the state. And it should be of great concern to the Bar Association across the board. I think the American Bar Association ought to look at what's going on both in Stanford and Georgetown, which I think maybe because of what they were 20 or 30 years ago, still have a good reputation, and I'm sure they'll still, sucker some kids into going there. But what's going on at the intolerance of both of these law schools is something that should be looked at, and I hope perhaps individual bar associations around the country also want to monitor as to what we can make of the intolerance in both of these law schools. My final comment as far as what's going on this week is something I've talked about in the past and want to talk about one more time, and that's what's going on in Ukraine. My major concern with the Biden administration is I don't think they are trying to end this war. I mean, we are where we are, but the longer the war goes on, the closer the alliance between Russia and China goes. In the relatively recent background, we had, 1,000 McDonald's in Russia. I know people in my personal life who had jobs in Russia. We had Russians coming here doing jobs on our farms. We had come here with special visas where the college-age kids from Russia were working in the vacation industry. But obviously right now, relationships falling. With regard to China, over time, relationships are getting worse and worse, which is a dangerous thing. We've had peace with China for well over 60 years. I don't know why we can't do another 60 years, but President Biden is not making, I believe, an effort to wrap up this war, and it shouldn't be that difficult. Ukraine has the second lowest birth rate of any country in the world. If there's any country that doesn't want to lose some of its young people, it ought to be Ukraine. Nobody can tell me that Vladimir Putin thought when he entered Ukraine the war would be going on this long. It's another country with a low birth rate. It's a country that's losing people as they emigrate to other countries. Both Ukraine and Russia should have motive to end this war, and eventually it will end. But the sooner it will end, the better. And I am afraid the Biden administration seems satisfied to just sit there, let things go on. Every day more young Russians, more young Ukrainians die. And not only is that a tragedy in its own right, but every day that this war goes on, it's going to be that much harder to reach a peace. So I strongly wish that President Biden would use this interlude before we try to put more billions of dollars on Ukraine, that he would, if the United States can't do it, and I can understand why we can't broker a peace because we don't look like we're neutral in this fight, but beg the Turks or the Israelis or the French or somebody who has more standing to step in and see if we cannot find an end to this war before it becomes much more catastrophic, before maybe the United States becomes involved, before Russia decides to shoot something at Western Europe, use its submarines off of American shores. So I strongly hope that the press, when they get a chance to interview President Biden, ask him, what are you doing, or do you feel it would be good for this war to end? Or are you just going to throw up your hands and pretend like you're an innocent bystander, and if the war goes on another 4 or 5 years, it's all fine by President Biden? Well, there we have 4 issues that I don't think we had enough attention paid to them during the course of the week. I hope the press corps gives them some attention, during the next week when we're back in our districts, and I hope our leadership brings more attention to them when we return from our districts. Is it 10? I think 11 days from now. So thank you very much. And we yield. We have. Oh, okay. There is. We'll go for one more topic right now. While my good friend returns from his office. There is an effort made right now in America with regard to school lunches to shift from milk to sugary drinks. And this is something else we don't pay a lot of attention to, but a lot of children get a lot of their food from school lunch. And I would be hard-pressed to find anybody who would say that we are better having kids drink sugary, gooey drinks than wholesome milk. Milk has been around since the Bible, right? Israel, a land of milk and honey. But apparently there is an anti-milk feeling out there. I do know that gooey, sugary drinks are sold by big corporations that are very active in all segments here in Washington. But I hope that this is something else the press will pick up on. I mean, just because little children can't vote doesn't mean that this ought to be a banner headline at least once a month as to whether the next generation of children is raised on gooey, sugary drinks or wholesome 100% milk, which has been such a big part of the diet of Americans since our founding. And we hope that our bureaucracy holds the line and does good research into the good and the bad of sugary drinks, as well as the nutritious value of 1% whole milk. And again, if any members of the press or the chair wants to look into this, I think it will be very important, because the health, and we have spiraling out of control healthcare costs in this country, the health of the next generation is largely going to be determined, or to a large degree be determined, what is going on with the youngest children. We are at a precarious time in our country in which the drug companies want to begin prescribing en masse anti-obesity drugs to little children. I heard this week that parents are being told that sometimes their children as young as 8 or 9 are going to begin to be prescribed anti-obesity drugs. Now, I can understand why that's a gold mine for the drug companies. I mean, we are such an over-drug company already, and if they can pudge, make a little more pudgy our young people, the idea that that they would have to take anti-obesity drugs for the next 70 years of their life. I mean, the eyes of some of these pharmaceutical executives must just brighten up at the idea that that is going to become the norm of America. But I would suggest we step back for a second, analyze what is healthier and what is less likely to make you obese, and encourage healthy foods. I think we were also talking here with regard to the WIC program. I hope we weigh in both on the WIC and the food stamps and the school lunch programs, all with more nutritious foods. And if we get back more to the nutritious foods that the average American was eating 60 years ago, we won't have to worry about giving all the young children anti-obesity drugs. because people of my generation lived a whole life without them. And I can understand, it might be more profitable for some people to have a lot of obese kids, but we don't need that. It's bad for them. And I hope the press really monitors what's going on as we try to step away from whole milk and other what I'll call natural foods, and instead push our way towards sugary processed food, which I think is one of the reasons why Americans' children right now are so much heavier than they were when I was a child. So we look forward to that situation. Now, I will yield right now.